Hello everyone, today we talk about the military engineers of the High Middle Ages or Low Middle Ages. Actually, we will keep this frame today temporarily between the 12th and the 13th centuries, that are these moments of great development of siege warfare, of military engineering into Western Europe. We're going to stick mostly to essentially a French perspective, because France is, relatively, it's well documented at the time at this point, and also for reasons that I will explain now. So some of the greatest advancements in military engineering, but it's this can be extended also to other regions, and this is a video, and I have to tell it now. It goes very well along with one I made a few time ago, that is called Breaching Enemy Walls, Considerations on Medieval Siege Warfare 885-1332. And I say this because that video was meant to be actually looking a bit more about on military engineering as a whole, and it ended up instead talking mostly about Trebuchets, and it was fine. It was a video I liked actually, but it was about breaching enemy walls in general. So also talking about other siege weaponry, and like, I don't know, battering rams, siege towers, even ladders, everything. But we basically ended up talking about artillery, or whatever you want to call it. It's this siege engines, a stone projectile, missile machinery. So today, instead, we will focus a little bit more, not very much in depth, not very structurally, on the figure of the military engineers proper. That is, let's be aware that the Middle Ages was indeed the civilization of the machines. The degree of inventiveness, of pragmatism, of open-mindedness, and of sheer, practice experience of even empiricism in part is really something you find at this moment into medieval history, and especially between the 12th and the 13th century, where medieval siege warfare was, albeit slowly, naturally, for our standards, for instance, whereas however, developing substantially in terms of especially of capability of storming fortifications of the time, that however in parallel were still expanding and developing themselves in turn. There is actually, it's very difficult to say, castles in between the 12th and 13th century were increasingly large, because simply it's just the consequence of a siege technology that was improving. Actually, the two things were improving at the same time, and it's very easy to say, because we are generally, as moderns, oriented towards that direction. We think that a new terrible weapon arrives and changes everything. But telling the truth, even that weapon is already the consequence of a war that is changing, that has already changed substantially before. I will do anything possible on Schwerpunkt to emphasize, and I can't stress this enough, really, of the idea that technologies do not change the world. It's societies that change the world, because it's a society that creates the technology for solving a problem that has been posed by certain evolution of society. So there is no progress in the teleological sense of the word. It's not that just firearms even later arrived, and that's what really changed things, because also firearms could be used only in a context where, however, there was the chance of using them. In terms of availability of resources, of certain type of, political and social organization, and obviously I give you that technology does make an impact in this sense, also actively. I'm not saying that it's completely useless, especially if we take, useless, that doesn't have an impact. It is a mere consequence as such. Obviously, especially if you look at an epiphenomenal level, it's obvious that also military engineering, like now that certain castles were now stronger because trebuchets were being adopted. But that's epiphenomenal. In fact, it doesn't show, because that's the first thing you concentrate on, you focus on, and when in this process you forget the whole political and social developments of the time, you kind of obviously narrow that down to, oh well, it was because it was technology kicked in, because you don't see why that technology was adopted in the first place. And I will be discussing also extensively about medieval artillery in the future. Recently, it happened to me to talk substantially about artillery, especially towards the late medieval, early modern period. I don't know why. And just the other way, I made another video on Renaissance artillery, and made another one on the XII-XIII that also deals in part with these problems. But with today's video, I would like to really give a broader dimension to this phenomenon, focusing on the humans that made these changes possible. I mean, this is pretty obvious. Also, technologistic prejudices are so bad because they kind of dehumanize science and technology. But it's all about us. It's all about our applications. It's all about our brain working and to find solutions and so on. And the military engineers of the Middle Ages are a bit neglected, we must say, in part. Also in pop culture, the general idea of warfare is still something pretty much tribal and warrior-like in nature. I mean, the idea that there is the tough guy who actually gets the thing done by just chopping to pieces the enemy, and because he's cool and strong and so all this stuff. But warfare is primarily a matter of logistics, that is, of organization, and especially of intelligence. There have been certain philosophers of war that went so far as saying it's warfare is war is all a matter of was more intelligent. This is not really true as well, but generally it is. I mean, in military history, it's not the strongest that wins. Usually it's the more intelligent that wins. So this expansion of siege, say this development of siege warfare during the Middle Ages, corresponds naturally to many different impulses that were coming from that world. In Europe, there was very fast, evolving very fast for those time standards. But we don't have to forget the individual at this point. Not looking at the strictly systemic thing, but also looking at these individuals and starting to understand where, for instance, they could get their this know-how from. And I'm saying that these military engineers are neglected because indeed we know very few about them. Usually, we don't have such an enormous quantity of material. Surely, it's plenty of sources of documents. I think that other video on the breaching enemy walls, I discussed a little bit the figure of Villard de Honnecourt, who was one of the greatest, also military engineers of the time. That not really. He's not famous just because of that. He was essentially an architect, not a military engineer proper, but he kind of embodies this. He died sometimes in the 13th century. That's how few we know. But he's mostly famous because he has produced several, especially the Livre de Portraiture, which is this practically, it presents many drawings about architectonic techniques, and also many other subjects, including, in fact, beautiful depictions of a trebuchet. It is also accompanied by this description that tells you how it had to be built, how it was. It had the how it had to be practical. It exposed kind of the problems, the technicalities of the technical problems of how to build a properly functional trebuchet and so on. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. But we're not going to talk about him today. He was not probably one of the greatest military engineers. If I said that, it's kind of improper at best. But it kind of, it was this all-knowing person that, in this sense, shows pretty much this hybrid nature of the engineers at this time. There were people who basically, this is typical of the Middle Ages actually, and also part of the modern age, that these architects were capable practically of building up everything if they were, or at least they were interested in a wide range of inventions, of structures, of mechanisms, of machines, and this representation of trebuchet is definitely very important, because it's being depicted in Villard's book as, in fact, in very technical way. So it also, he was representing it through his own mind of knowing how it worked and how it could be applied. But the most of the times we know, and this is a rarity, because Villard wrote in a time which trebuchets were being essentially developed. So that's also why it's so important, because it's a very early, I think, I'm not sure whether the earliest depiction of the trebuchet proper, because many other types of say so-called catapults were already naturally known. I mean, even this idea that siege machinery, especially also in stone projectile machines and stone, projecting machines, were disappearing during the early Middle Ages is not entirely true. I mean, throughout all the early medieval times, there were these stone projecting weapons that actually were used even by populations who are generally credited not to have had this enormous development in terms of siege warfare, like for instance the Vikings, that definitely, if they could build the ships they did, they surely could easily plan at the siege of Paris, in fact, in 885, that those were used, in fact. So there is and this is the main point, perhaps, is that has to be borne in mind. There is a huge underground development, submerged development of these technologies that we actually cannot see, historically speaking, because we don't have enough sources, and therefore we tend to be too tied sometimes to the idea that until something is not proven to have been there by the sources, it didn't exist, or at least it existed, but since we don't know enough, we can't periodize in a different way. This is something I've always kind of battled against, because I believe that, yeah, of course, history should be made about evidence, about sound evidence, actually, but there are so many problems that actually also are not so strictly connected to, I don't know, when this machinery was first created, but rather why and how it was created. I think that's the moment of the origin, the moment of the genesis. That's really probably the most fascinating thing, because I don't know, how do you imagine, for instance, I don't know, the first trebuchet being built? Because in my opinion, it was something that probably existed even much before than we can think. Not maybe with the same technical characteristics, definitely much more primitive, but it's really the concept, the physical concept of having this, essentially this counterweight that is tied, and then you let it go, and with gravity falls down violently, and it's able to transfer this energy to the arm that throws basically the projectile that is tied to the other side. That's something elementary. I mean, it's the same concept of the early medieval pattery, only that instead of having muscular force of all these men tying, or women sometimes, as we will see at the Siege of Toulouse, pulling ropes, all together would launch that thing. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just, now with a counterweight made of stone or dirt, attached to that. And it's in fact, it's naive to believe that certain inventions weren't really that. In fact, they came as a finished product. This is also the idea that we mostly fall into in many things. Actually, that there are many times in history in which, in spite of the progressivity of certain developments, you realize that, at least from the sources and the evidence, therefore, we have, certain things kind of were built as if they were already finished. I mean, they were already fully functional, at least for that specific context, and that tells you that it's impossible that the thing was, created just in that moment, as if nobody had ever even thought of that, or had never tried to build something similar before. So that's also something we should be a bit more careful about, and therefore not concentrating on the technology as such, because it's very easy, as we were saying before, to say, that's just because a guy, read that from a manuscript. No, these were things that these people were developing on their own, because people are not stupid, that they don't take a manual to build something like that. This never happened. So manuals have been created when there was already a know-how, for which there were more people that were interested in that field, because they knew it was already developed, and therefore needed a manual to transfer this knowledge from, to hand it down generation by generation. But the manual exists only in an advanced stage. These things were essentially developed in a world that had already experimented these things. And also here, since something was not written down, doesn't mean that it wasn't functional. At the beginning of the 18th century, take the Dutch Navy, for instance. There was the Dutch at the time had some of the most advanced naval engineering at the time. There were no manuals. But and this is very, very important, because everything was basically taught orally. And I'm saying this because, of course, there were manuals. Even in there was not as civilization wouldn't conceive it, but they weren't widespread as much to make that art pass handed on generation by generation. Aside, of course, there were these craftsmen were also pretty much jealous of their know-how, and so on. But this is something that struck, for instance, Peter the Great of Russia, that when it basically went into the Netherlands to learn how to build ships, because he wanted to create a Russian navy on his own. Afterwards, he wanted to go to Venice, and in this European journey he couldn't, because he eventually had to come back to Russia. But in Venice instead, it was plenty of manuals on how to build galleys that eventually were the model that Peter took for the Baltic Sea, not the high sea ships with but the galleys. And he was struck by these Dutch carpenters and these engineers who built ships and he couldn't basically bring anything back from the Netherlands as a written thing. And he also began to work with them together with the shipbuilding. So it's very interesting, because it shows you it's something, you can't. It's very difficult to understand for us. But the idea that you can do things without having a manual, without having a written, and this was essentially the Middle Ages, largely, and also, in fact, the sources that we have usually are of difficult interpretation, because although from this 12th and 13th century we start having as a source lots of manuscripts that depict even this machinery of all sort, because I repeat, it wasn't just about being a military engineer. It was really being an engineer 360 degrees. Like, we don't know, however, in these manuscripts whether what was pictured in there, doesn't matter how technically represented and rendered in the drawing, was actually used in that sense. I mean, sometimes we have difficulty to see. Obviously, from certain depictions, we realize that these were drawings thought to be also functional to an eventual construction, because they showed elements that were kind of important to make, to show how essentially how this machinery worked practically. So really, there was an engineering mindset in there that wanted to express this function through the effective function, how this thing practically worked. But most of the times, we also look at this thing and say, okay, yeah, they look kind of fine. They're pretty precise. They're also very useful for us to understand how this machinery practically worked. But at the same time, in the same nature of these manuscripts, you realize it's more kind of exemplary. I mean, it doesn't have this. It's not really an engineering manual. It's something very different. It's just, showing this marvel, even to people that maybe didn't have to learn how to build them, but just making them aware. And these were, I don't know, sketches sometimes also. It's funny because these texts were accompanied naturally by, in fact, written information as well. Sometimes these drawings were also marginal to the text, in a way that they were also, drawn, can say randomly, but you realize that at least for who wrote that book, there is no even a kind of a systematization, a rationalization of how to insert these drawings into the thing. So it's something approximated enough for us to say, okay, this is a book that shows these inventions, but we know that those who practically built them had a lot of know-how on their own that had to exist necessarily next to this for make these things work, that we don't have anymore. And this is a pity, because this happens in so many epochs. It's not just a matter of the medieval times. Even this is valid, especially also not just in matters of engineering, but a bit in all the technical stuff. If you take, for instance, the Roman military manuals that started appearing from the early empire. There is this at the end, and eventually to the Byzantine tradition, they continue existing. You realize that these were books mostly written by senators or people eventually of the imperial court that were just the guys who led the armies, for instance. So, for instance, all that knowledge that could be proper of other officers or NCOs is practically lost. And this is partly useful because it makes us understand at that level what is that these commanders had to deal with. That they weren't, that there was a machine, a military machine in that specific context that was already fully functional on its own, because it was a sort of an organism, an autonomous organism that worked, but was capable of also being self-sufficient, self-organized, and so on. And that it just took one guy at the top arriving and commanding the army for making this army practically moving by itself. And unfortunately, we have lost all the knowledge, all what those other centurions or legionnaires knew, because simply these people didn't write, or at least maybe they wrote, but they didn't write anything extremely complex, and because it was not important at the time. It's something you can do without someone without you needing to read a book for doing it. And most of our history is essentially about this. Because we have to get rid from the idea that if you don't have a manual, you can't do things. Humans do things and do them pretty well, up to a certain point of technological evolution, for which you need a more structured education. Therefore, you need treatises and so on. That's the reason why such technicalities start, to be clearer only from, the Renaissance onwards, more or less, but also in there very progressively. There are many inventions, even, take Leonardo Da Vinci, for instance. There are so many beautiful drawings in his work, but that they do not necessarily tell it all. I mean, these were drawings that he made because I don't know, he had maybe that idea, he wanted to keep it in his mind, but there was a lot in his mind that was so pragmatical, so technical, so even talking about the minutiae or other technicalities that we don't find written, but that he knew, and that he knew through sheer practice, through sheer experience, and that were not written down also for a very simple reason, that there was someone out there, also, not very rarely, I mean, not as a difficult resource to find, that they already knew those things. There were corporations who worked like that, who had that know-how that was handed down generation by generation. So if someone wanted to know how to build something, they just took to go to them, to ask, to learn the craft, and it was it. So that's also the reason why we don't have such sources, or at least we have such a vague understanding. But this should never lead us to say, okay, this was primitive because it wasn't written down. Because there was this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world behind it that unfortunately we will most likely never know anything about, because the reality is what it is. We don't have the sources, and they weren't written. But paradoxically, it's through this knowledge that we can, as I hoped I was able to explain, understand that there was something behind that. So that obviously absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but always treating this very careful as a as a statement when making history proper, but still knowing that, hey, we are humans, and probably some of the most important technological, our greatest understanding of history can arrive through our human awareness of the fact that we are humans, so we kind of work in a similar fashion, so that even if we don't have a proof, in fact, we can figure out, so we can make hypotheses and theories about how the world really was. And in spite we lack evidence, it's still full of traces, full of hints. So given the advancements of siege warfare at this time, and looking at, in fact, how intense, it's as if at this point Europe started to become more synetical. Even warfare between the 12th and 13th century began definitely to increase. There were much more wars, and also much larger wars than there had been in the past in Europe. This was the consequence of a system, of a broader system putting itself into motion and getting conflictual, getting agitated, so that the clashes would happen kind of more frequently than before. And that also was a more stratified world as well, for which there was, even in military affairs, a greater deal of organization. That means there were the more, say, powerful guys at the top that could rule over larger systems, and that in this sense they could even invest for such, in this case, siege machinery that before was thought of being, and in this sense, it's not that it didn't exist before, but it hadn't existed in this measure because there was nobody who had invested from the top. This is also very important. You have to look, in fact, at politics and society for that. This is the moment of major rise of the feudal kingdoms, substantially. And the feudal kingdom, in spite of being decentralized, was still pretty much centralized, much more centralized than it had been in the previous centuries, because now it wasn't just a bunch of lordships, essentially, of small provincial level lordships, or just maybe something larger. These were entire kingdoms, like, I don't know, chiefly, the largest monarchies at this time were the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England, but there were also others that could, in fact, organize as political and military entities a better functioning military system. They could especially extend excuse me, I'm setting certain things here. They could especially invest also in quality, not just in quantity, because at this point it would have not made sense to make, why were these machinery also development? Because, there were other machineries in the past, now we could build something greater. So that instead of 10 catapults, you could have one trebuchet that, in terms of costs, now I'm just throwing this proportion completely randomly, also because it doesn't make much sense. There were definitely siege machinery of any dimension, of every siege, every piece was essentially unique at the time. It's interesting that, in fact, there were these trebuchets, and sometimes were named individually, like it would happen, later with the great cannons into the late medieval and early modern times, so that there was, an idea one piece was indeed something on its own, something important, something peculiar. It's also something that could make the difference. As such, as individually speaking, it was not this, still pretty much this sense of series that comes with, especially the increasing of the standardization of production. Everything was really brought up. Even we can imagine in very different ways. I mean, what was that, for instance, that built objectively these trebuchets? I mean, yeah, we're seeing these military engineers, but where were they built, for instance? This is also a very important question to ask. I don't know personally. I'm sure that there are sources to tell where this would happen, but usually these bases were mounted during the siege itself, as far as I know. Others were carried instead, and we know it because we also have evidence. Especially, the trebuchet had actually a pretty long existence. They remained, in spite of also development of firearms up to the 16th century. They were. Then all of a sudden they disappear. With the beginning of the 16th century, you don't find them anymore, and it's pretty obvious for many reasons. But they kind of had a long life, and also in this this essentially three. We want to be generous, 4 centuries, depending where you think that the trebuchet was first, created. They also had a development. There is also this, this urge for gigantism, for which the idea, the bigger it is, the more it destroys. This is pretty, how humans get exalted in many ways. But in fact, as many other things, it's not. It's really a matter of quality rather than quantity that has the edge, especially in warfare. As there are also logistical problems. This is the point I was making. It's, if you have really to invest in many things, it's better if you invest in something, in a few that, however, works better, is more reliable. And this is also how these technologies were refined, because it was, I was saying before, is the concept of a trebuchet was practically known since even very lots of centuries, even from early medieval times, where that was the standard. But it simply worked, and the concept is practically the same. Now at this point there was just a slightly better technology was introduced to make that work in a more automatic way. So this stemmed not from a revolutionary thought that practically never happens in technology, but from the sheer practice. So I like the idea of seeing this evolution happening through a sheer increase of warfare that in fact pre-existed the same full development of this machinery. And this intensification of siege warfare that we have seen in the period naturally entailed and made it necessary, naturally, the ever frequent, the increasingly frequent presence in the from the sources, because that's where we get it from. It's not a speculation of a sort of technical personnel. So we're not talking just about the guys, the smart guys who designed these things and made them. These were usually masters and people who were, in fact, provided also the resource and the material to build it up, because they didn't have it presumably on their own. This was the sovereigns that entrusted them such, and that's how it normally happens. But we don't have to think just about them. But also about these forgotten heroes, like there was also probably less literate than the masters, that also, usually were literate, but they also could come from a sheer. Also, they could be maybe they would be illiterate. It was still possible. But think about this. All these miners, these pioneers, or other makers of various kind, actually, you can imagine to be also multitask in many ways. I mean, the idea, pioneers are in every army in all times in history kind of what the people who made literally the army move, because if you have masses of hundreds of of thousands of tens of thousands of men, people can move, but those have to move like an army. They don't have to move like individuals. So an army has necessarily to pass into a world. You just imagine what 12th century, 13th century Europe could be in terms of infrastructures, of communications, to make these things pass through rivers, through mountain passes. This was really, you needed someone who paved the road for you. And these were the pioneers at all times. What is interesting about them is also, and I don't know how in detail we can practically see it, that these weren't just mere, could say craftsmen lent to war. Sometimes these were actually military men themselves. And this is very important, that this personnel stemmed from the same military environment. These weren't obviously. Also in here we should make a premise. What is the military environment to the Middle Ages? Because the Middle Ages were a pretty highly militarized world. There was not the differentiations like today between the military men and the civilians. There were people who more or less were all, especially all male, able-bodied freemen, were meant to go to war when necessary. It was a world that knew a lot of this also small-scale warfare, raids, clashes between the communities. There was a low central authority, so violence was definitely higher on average than obviously the world we live in. So everybody kind of knew more or less how to do something, whether it was just know how to use a lance or a shield, but that was probably, especially in early medieval times, pretty obvious, pretty natural. Now this 12th, 13th century, especially in the feudal societies, were, especially the great masses, were tending to be disarmed now, because noblemen didn't want peasants to be armed, especially in countries like France, that is kind of the apex of feudalism. This is all the more evident, but nevertheless, these peasants still had certain military capabilities. So it was a world where you couldn't really distinguish the military man from or better, there were people who were meant to be all about war, the true war professionals, were knights, the milites in Latin, and those were the ultra elite. But we all know that even in feudal armies, at the acme of their development, there were constantly other people who were obviously not noble. They were obviously not not even absolutely not war professionals, that however were needed, and most of these numbers were in fact needed also for these engineering activities. When we hear in medieval sources, this is a problem we have all the time, because medieval sources do not specify this clearly, but when we read, I don't know, usually this was this idea that especially at the apex of the chivalry during the 13th century, that one knight was sufficient to kill 10 average people, let's say, in average fighters, let's say, in the army. So usually the perfect ratio was in the army was one knight and 10 other, usually commoners. So other also that were differentiated also tactically speaking, because the knight was preferably a mounted fighter. These other guys were largely spearmen, crossbowmen, archers, and stuff like that. But sometimes we have difficulties to see, also because just think about what it takes to feed lots of people. If you even if you in the 13th century see an army of 100 knights and 1,000 other infantry, let's say. At that point, you have to think 100 knights were also they had probably such a high military quality to render actually necessary many more than 1,000 in proportion infantrymen to stop them. And this is truer the greater the armies actually were, because the larger the army is, and the more difficulty with more difficulty you can coordinate it, especially in combat. So the idea is, especially these larger armies, of which you can find thousands. I don't know why I say it wrong today. Thousands or tens of thousands of troops. Sometimes these weren't at all. Maybe just a half of them were actually combat force. You have no certainty of this, but usually, while sources are and this is especially coming from crossing sources, because when you find this, witnesses of that specific army, you see that maybe all these sources give kind of fairly precise and common amount of, they agree on the number of knights, which naturally were also more important because these were kind of the elite of the society, so everybody cared who they were, for instance. So just for the sake of counting them, it was something that was easier to know who they were and how many they were. But when you look at the infantry, you see here these wilder variations, and sometimes you can say, well, maybe this source didn't know how many people there were in here. Most of the times I interpret it, obviously you have to look at the context, it depends all the times by the context, but these wild variations actually, in my opinion, have to do with the fact that here the authors were counting sometimes also the pioneers. So not really the combat force, but really how many people had joined into that context. And this kind of works also for the medieval mentality, in the sense that there was no scientificity attached to that. Also the categorization of these troops was objectively not necessary at the time. But it still made a difference whether you want to say, there were, 1,000 fighters or 2,000 people, because in that case you can understand the other 1,000 were maybe aides, field aides, pioneers, people who had to deal with supplies and so on, which is fundamental, because especially a feudal army at the time, given the war horses that existed there, their changes, all these things, were necessarily accompanied by a huge quantity of people who had to deal with the supplies, with logistics, and you couldn't eliminate them. And feeding a horse is something excruciatingly expensive. You need lots of people will work for that, and this increases also again in turn the logistical needs. So, and even though, sure, many of these followers, these regiments, were not military men, because also in medieval armies, like in many other armies in history, was full of other people who joined, like the merchants who hoped to seize what the army was seizing in terms of prisoners, in terms of weaponry, and so on. Prostitutes that were there all the time, in the Soviet, and many other, even think about marauders, people who wanted simply to loot again, and in this sense were sometimes not just passively following the army and waiting for looting, but actually were mounted also on their own. They kind of fought this reconnaissance, this scouting roles, they could be ambushers and so on, and that's a bit nature of the medieval armies. And you don't know whether when one thinks when the proper fighter starts and the just marauder of the field aid stops, because even if you look at figure of squires, you realize that these were pretty also active people in so many ways. They were so multitask. They were vital. squires. Knights without a squire was nothing, because he couldn't work, he couldn't fight, he couldn't have support. He needed that necessarily. So also during these centuries there are naturally many changes in this, but we're not going to focus on them. Maybe we'll discuss this on another occasion. But coming back to this technical personnel, how I define it, really there is a distinction you can make, especially starting from the end of the 12th century. There is this moment also of greater advancements, also the moment at which trebuchets were starting to appear more consistently, and there is especially a tiny group within all these people that is the one of the, I don't know even how to define them, actually the mechanicians or engineers, broadly meant, if you want, that had actually a professional nature in terms of in there, simply because they were paid. So they enjoyed these financial benefits that were proportional to the value that was attributed to their service. This is very important, because when you see professionalism kicking into warfare, you realize so many things about that society. You essentially know that society is making war practically beyond the usual seasonal rhythm. There are people who essentially are there because they're paid by someone else. So you also realize society is enough stratified. There is someone who can afford to pay for them. It's not a self-organized society that more or less relies on the individual effort. There is a very strong way of organizing things. And their presence, obviously, war professionals existed already in the form of, in fact, of knights, as we have said it, and the professionalism has always kind of been there, even in the most traditional and seasonal kind of warfare. There's always been someone who practically was in arm and fought all the time. At this time things get, in fact, here more organized in a broader sense. So even this personnel that starts getting paid is definitely something new, or maybe not so new also in here, so nothing extremely anew completely, but definitely something that starts getting organized in a fashion that didn't exist before. And obviously for the sake of producing this siege warfare, or also other forms of engineering that was needed for making it, even the army move. This goddamn dog's barking outside. Excuse me. Can't stand them. Can't stand people who make this. Excuse me. Just a bit of an interruption. Yeah, because it's starting to get too warm inside the room, and I have to leave the window open. But there is this damn dogs barking all the time, and when I get up, they stop barking, and when I sit down, they start barking once again. So they get on my nerve. They get on my nerves. Sorry. So I was saying, what was I saying? That this was definitely this rise in this personnel and their payment. So as we were saying before, this personnel emerged, at least this is what seemingly has been figured out, from a strictly military environment. So these were people who started to make a fortune because they had been into war. I mean, they had participated in one way or another to these conflicts, and they had started to make a living in practice out of this activity of their know-how. So their origins naturally were not completely military, in the sense that the know-how that they were offering to the army now was something that derived probably by other activities. Architects, engineers, and this had already existed, always existed. Also, I hate how sometimes early medieval times are treated mostly, especially certain areas of Europe had always people working, even with stone, with there has always been a kind of a strong advancement, and continued architectural tradition into Europe. The idea everything kind of finished into the early medieval times, and only at this point starts popping out is just plain naive and anti-historical. Also because we have even very clear, explicit, even and direct evidence of that. And we can find certain episodes here and there. For instance, there is the presence in certain sources of also earlier sources of such figures. For instance, during the First Crusade, at the time of the conquest, during the siege of Jerusalem, actually, Raymond de Guillers says that basically there were certain technicians, as you want to call them, that were ordered by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond de Saint-Gilles to build, during the siege, in fact, these different in the Latin sources, these are defined as linea castra, machine et machinamenta. So linea castra would be also it's interesting here because lineos means obviously wood, built in wood, and castrum here is a plural castra, but it's the same thing. It's the same term that was used actually to define the castles, the properly fixed, fortifications. So sometimes these siege towers, you can imagine, and at the time were looking like something like objectively castles on their own. Also pretty big. I mean, if you consider Moat and Bailey Castle, it's not something huge. Actually, it's more about the terraplane and this slope where they were usually built that made it formidable fortresses. It was actually easier even to build in such a way. But just think about putting under siege a walled city like Jerusalem, or you have to build something pretty big that kind of actually resembles a castrum. So also here, philologically speaking, it's interesting to look at how sometimes these people used the same concept of building a castle that could move practically with a siege warfare. Machinet, machinamenta are in Latin are simply machines and machineries. Practically, we think would be the proper differentiation. So it's sometimes this is also very important that from the sources we don't always have a very highly scientific and categorical definitions. This is typical actually not just of the Middle Ages but also of the ancient world. We start having more even during the modern age. Sometimes we don't know. There are sources who call certain weapons both arquebuses and muskets. And albeit there was a substantial, kind of substantial differentiation, sometimes we can't objectively distinguish them, especially in that moment of transition. So this was true for all these eras. It's just during essentially the 18th century we start having something more, this idea of kind of drawing precise categories into which making names fit in. But this is not a limit. You don't have it. Also, this was completely normal at the time. It didn't bring any confusion because kind of everybody knew what you were talking about at the time. Today we don't, chiefly because in fact we don't have this direct evidence. It's often mediated, but we can kind of figure out what these people meant. And it's also very important to know how these names were coupled together. To understand how these people reasoned relatively to them. Here, for instance, the distinction between linea castra and the macchina et machinam, it's kind of, it can lead you to speculate a little bit, because the linea castra definitely to me sound like the siege towers, because they're so resemblant in terminology what a castle would be. Macchina et machinamenta are kind of more, I don't know, maybe they are, machina is something more simpler, is more simpler, say simpler, sorry for my English, because sometimes even ladders were called machines. This is pretty strange. I mean, to us, the machine is, in our mind, is just think how semantically things shift. It's something more complex, something more, because we come, in fact, to live into. You happen to live into fully industrialized world, so it's we immediately get this immediate. But at the time, a machine, in fact, was, as a term, was pretty generic, and maybe machinamenta and this were instead those things were a bit more, in fact, mechanic in nature. Maybe had, I don't know, ropes or pulleys and so on. And if you look, in fact, from the iconographical sources, you realize that these machines could also be pretty complex and pretty articulated, and with cranes, with things. So they were a bit everything, both for shifting troops or assaulting enemies. So the inventiveness here, I would like to emphasize, even though we're not looking at these things in detail now, because it's just about military engineers as figures, but their works were sometimes extremely clever, extremely developed, extremely ingenious, in the sense that they had to adapt also to a physical reality that indeed, with the technology of the time, was very difficult to overcome. I mean, there were certain physical problems that indeed, are present even today, but definitely for medieval technology were also a greater match, and it's still these people knew how perfectly to cope, how to cope with them. This is all the more interesting because it proves that medieval times were nothing, absolutely all but, backwards, or on the contrary. And it takes much more intelligence to solve those problems with those means than it takes with our own today. So just to say, we're not more intelligent than people who came before us. As we were saying before, France and England at this time were kind of on the lead as essentially as organizers, because actually, if we take the sheer technology at this time, this was being developed essentially in Lombardy. Northern Italy was kind of the center of the greatest development in Europe, naturally. That's where you find the greatest experimentalism, also where you find much more dynamism. It was related also to the problem that, in fact, Italy was communal Italy that was politically fragmented, so there were different problems compared. It was a different warfare compared, to what was happening in other countries. Also, it was not so different in practice, but that was the main center of technological development. However, it was, in fact, as we were saying before, great feudal kingdoms like France and England that could put, however, more of these things together, and because for the sake of this, needing to register even and to leave sources how to, for instance, for the crown, to pay these engineers. And in fact, it's from the terrible wars that occurred between John Lackland of England and Philip II Augustus of France. They're also pretty interesting for many reasons. Obviously, think about the Battle of Bouvines, among the other things. That we start having, in parallel with these wars, it's kind of the first, I believe, or at least among the first, not really the first, but let's say that the mention of engineers, the mentioning of engineers becomes more usual, more regular. So this means that there was a big deal of professionalism attached to this, and it is definitely evident, especially from the from the French side, because Philip the second Augustus had been very clever at this point. He was fighting into northern France against the English, essentially with a mercenary army, because he had tried. Basically, had been he had fortunately got rid of his French vassals who were pretty rebellious and so on by sending them to fight against the Albigensians in the south of France, whereas northern England was northern France now was becoming a battlefield where Philip was using a essentially a mercenary army that was in this sense more reliable. We should also, the medieval times are a pretty good evidence most of the times how mercenaries could be actually much more functional and even more faithful than feudal levies, and even than national levies, let's say. I know we say, well, think about the condotta, the period of it. Yeah, but that was still, it's not that those mercenaries were less reliable than many vassals at this time. In feudal Europe, this was especially a problem. And after all, also, if you take the Anglo-German army at Bouvines, there were, for instance, Brabantine or mercenaries at the time. So it's kind of, this idea of professionalism starts to kick in. In fact, the 13th century, in spite of being kind of the acme of feudal warfare, you realize that it contained also the pretty evident seeds of the transformation of the same feudal system into something more actually monetized. And this idea of the feudal levy, that this mostly agricultural work now was transitioning fast towards something else, something more financial, something that also started the various social differences. I wouldn't say crumbling, but where also commoners now were taking a pretty big stand also on the battlefields. Not really, in the 13th century this happened rarely, but at the same time in certain regions of Europe were occurring timidly certain developments that was full completion would eventually appear at the beginning of the 14th century, where in fact infantries of commoners were able to defeat alone, that is without other cavalry, the feudal elite, the feudal cavalry. But this is another point. Just for saying that the professionalism increases at this point in every field of warfare, including this one of the military engineers. For instance, John Lackland was followed in Normandy in 1201 by a master called Ulrich. I don't know where he could come from. It sounds Germanic name, but I wish I should check it out. But sometimes we have this very scanty evidence that, however, like saying this name appears, but we don't know much in a chronicle maybe, but we don't know much about him anymore. And it simply says in the Latin source, that Ulrich was accompanying King John ad facenda ingenia, so with the aim of creating this ingenia, were also in here kind of a synonym of machines. So it's the ingenium, so this idea of the inventions practically. So meant as, however, in this very material sense, this pragmatical sense, in this also military sense in this context. It's also interesting that these guys appear as individuals. So as in other fields of European society at the time, there were these kind of unique figures like masters, like professors. They were essentially usually at the head of certain schools, because there were people who wanted to learn the craft, so they were started joining. And this is how basically even universities were being born. So in universities normally these things were not studied, because universities were born chiefly for the sake of learning law and theology. but let's say that the pattern was pretty much the same. I mean, even in the workshops in so on, it was normal. You had a master, and then the other people went there, um, like apprentices, and they would learn. So there was a chief ruling figure, the master, in fact, that in this sense kind of um, um, shines also through the sources, because he was objectively the leader, and this person was evidently not alone. I mean, he had aides, he had other people together with them, but it's also the individuality of these people that stresses sometimes the kind of entrepreneurial nature. Mm. Also these activities that were seen as such, because war is a business objectively, so that's a very good occasion, especially if you are able to become friend with a sovereign. And we'll see now, in fact, that these engineers were quite well received and by the sovereigns, because they were objectively a resource. They were a very important and very profitable human resource, because objectively knowing how to build these machineries was the key to success in so many. Given how siege warfare was becoming intense at this point. And incidentally, this is what I wanted to say, is that feudal Europe at this time was not just, in fact, paying for these people to build, in fact, the siege weapons, but also to build castles. So this went from both sides, both on the offensive and on the defensive. And there were arguably also kind of the same people. Yeah, okay, maybe the guy who knew how to build trebuchet maybe wasn't the same one who built castles. There's a kind of opposition, destructive versus constructive idea. Everybody likes to. I would have been from the side of trebuchet because I like to smash things. No, I'm kidding now. But it's obvious that in order to build an effective trebuchet, you had to know the essentials of military engineering at all levels, because you needed to know how a castle was built if you wanted to destroy it. Kind of makes much sense. So it was like a lot of knowledge blended together, and this is the point that feudal monarchies were at this time once were able to invest more in these individual enterprises. So there were also the countries that kind of built the bigger castles at the time. So if you go to France, if you go to England, you see these magnificent castles that are so early sometimes, that were built so early in time, compared to other areas of Europe that instead didn't have the degree of centralization, and that because of this were maybe even more technologically advanced. And we've seen like Italy, maybe Germany not, but let's say that there were other places like here that, however, do not have this kind of castles, because there weren't big feudal solid kingdoms that could invest into building a castle. That was very big, because objectively it was an enormous expense. But at that time it was worth it, because castles had this massive strategical value, and in fact also the wars between France and England at this time were kind of evident. Think about Chateau Gaillard at this time was considered an impregnable fortification that I think Richard I had built in along the Seine River, and Philip II was able finally to seize it. But after a siege, it was so enormously expensive. So, and it had brought, in fact, to such a great employment of military engineers to build a sort of stone ramp to arrive there. It was something very interesting. Maybe we will discuss this someday. Excuse me, I drink a little bit more. But there is another episode, very famous, that is the siege of Toulouse in 1218 during the Albigensian Crusade, and this was actually a very important siege because it was kind of the last I'm opposed of the kind of for the French. For Simon de Montfort, there was one of those French knights that he had been sent by Philip II and the Pope to seize southern France. Toulouse was this major center. The counts of Toulouse had been this major nobleman that the most powerful nobleman of southern France, extremely wealthy, were also rivaling kind of with the court of Paris. And so on. It was a massive siege, and mostly famous because it's kind of where all the crusading success crumbled, simply because Simon de Montfort, who was the leader of the expedition, was killed by a mangonel projectile, manned or better women actually by, in fact, the women of Toulouse, because this was not actually a it was a mangonel, proper, not a trebuchet, that was used by operated by women at this point. Think about the shame in the feudal world that it had this idea of the angelic woman and so on. It was also otherwise a pretty misogynistic world. The shame for a knight to be killed by women, and it kind of most the unluckiest guy ever, because to be hit by a mangonel shot, it's you have to be pretty unlucky. But this also tells you how frequent actually nowadays the use of such weapons was. This was a mangonel used by the besieged people of Toulouse. And also interesting that women were called to operate it, because women actually appear quite prominently, especially in the defense of cities at this point. There are many sources, many also beautiful iconographic sources show this. It's kind of fascinating, and this made kind of the whole southern France, this crusader achievements in southern France kind of crumble, because having Simon died in that way, practically all his rule over the region kind of collapsed. And we have an evidence for this siege that there were two actually specialists in ballistics, Bernard Parère and the Master Garnier. So these were working for the besieged of Toulouse, and who knows, maybe it was these guys who had made those women operating that mangonel that killed Simon. However it went, it's an important source, because it tells you really even how sometimes we get the stereotype that that the artillery was used only by the offenders, by the attackers. This is not really true. This artillery was present everywhere, on the city, on the walls. There were similar weapons. So it was this continuous exchange of. It wasn't a very intense fire, as you can imagine, but it was enough even to make some psychological warfare, because especially for smaller castles, being bombarded every once in a while, but it was enough, not, for instance, to make you fall asleep. I found certain sources, I think it was from 14th century Italy, that kind of there were people who surrendered because they weren't able to sleep under the fire of this. So they kind of went nuts. If people don't sleep, they do went nuts. They do go nuts. Still, and this could be used in so many ways, and that reveals you also how possible it was to make it kind of continuous. Obviously, the fire rate was ridiculous, but nevertheless, it was effective for that particular warfare, for that particular context. We know by the year 2020 that Louis IX, while wanting to capture the castle of Belém, he made an appeal to all those who knew how to mine. Also, engineering, a big deal of military engineering at this point was about tunneling under the fortifications. This is obviously not always possible. It depends on the terrain, but it actually was pretty advanced at the time. There were many episodes, of castles that literally crumbled, at least in one section of the walls, because someone had mined them underneath. And with the most ingenious things, sometimes there were even one, I don't remember where it was in England, and the siege of, I don't even remember, but that basically they sent a lot of pigs into the tunnel under the city, under the castle, and it was the siege of Rochester, if I'm not wrong. And they basically set the pigs on fire through, I don't know whether through peach or I don't know what. So basically these pigs within the tunnel that were now closed, through the combustion, kind of freed so many gas that the pressure of this gas made the tunnels crumble, and together with it all the walls that were over them. So it's kind of interesting, kind of clever. But the poor pigs naturally are, poor innocents that ended in this way. But it's kind of ingenious if you think about it. There's also certain notions about the idea of, these guys knew that combustion produced gas. That is not, by the 13th century, it's not something I wouldn't say you would expect, but even if it was known, and it was used as a knowledge to be put into practice effectively. So these are all things that are actually, they sound even kind of ridiculous if you think about it, but from our perspective at the time is a great achievement. Actually, you have to give them that they objectively knew how to do things that probably if we tried us today we wouldn't be able to do. And in the same occasion of the siege of Belém of 1220, we know that Louis IX also had two machineries that were manned by several technicians. During the French invasion of Egypt under Louis IX, Jocelyn de Corneau had the mention of master engineer, and he presided over the construction of two machines together with his companions. So all these engineers, well, some of them at least became also kind of celebrities. Just think even about, now it's kind of silly, but even the idea of storming a castle at that day was, it's as if, I don't know, and someone had done something incredible at the time, because also castles were sometimes, they had this great fame that couldn't be stormed, couldn't be captured. So even these individuals were clever enough to say, look at what I'm able to get rid of this problem, and through my skills were actually praised as great minds. I was making kind of a parallelism with football players, but I realized that football players are not so intelligent like obviously military engineers in the Middle Ages. But it's kind of the degree of celebrity that these people could attain is sometimes remarkable, especially when and this was sanctioned by the royal reconnaissance of their own merits. For instance, and some of them could make brilliant careers. For instance, there is the Gascon Jean de Mezzos, I believe it's pronounced, that had this was actually always under Louis IX. He had the qualification of Magister Ingeniorum or Ingeniator, so basically master of the inventions, master of the engines, and ingeniator, so engineer in practice. But and he was actually, him in a brilliant career, because he was even knighted by Louis IX in 1254 for his achievements in technology, as a matter of fact, and he worked also the construction of several castles, as we were saying before, in Gascony, and eventually he also passed to the service of the Count of Savoy up to the years 1271, 1272. So a whole actually whole life spent like as a professional, in fact, in that field, and it's a kind of astonishing, career. This guy was knighted, so he became a knight. He invested, dubbed by the King of France himself. This is the 13th century. This is the France of Louis IX. So a moment in which basically France reaches an enormous power and makes a lot of war, incidentally, and also expands into into regions where, in this sense, military engineering was always more required, because Louis IX, for instance, was the one who managed to eventually marriage ties to seize definitely southern France after the disadventure of Simon de Montfort. Also because southern France after that war was wasted practically, but not only. And the French opened at this point actually their first contact with the Mediterranean. Obviously the French. When I'm talking about the French in this context, I'm talking about the northern French, and actually the Kingdom of France, as the place that was directly controlled by the French king. And there were no viable ports. So actually, that's when Louis IX built Aigues-Mortes in southern France. It's a hell of a place. I had the luck to visit it, and you can understand also how much work that needed, because that was the way now France could enter the Mediterranean, space into the Mediterranean. That's where, in fact, Louis IX leads the crusade into Egypt, and also the second one in Tunisia, where actually he died before even reaching Egypt. But it was the idea that also the expansion of these realms. The case of France is naturally very important, because at this time was the most powerful country in Europe. Was now also to get into worlds like, in fact, the maritime one, where also engineering was pretty much advanced, and where paradoxically that know-how had come from, because usually Europeans are credited to have acquired so much knowledge in military engineering, chiefly through the Mediterranean. With the Crusades, so expanding a world that already needed naval engineering, that actually was already quite developed in Western Europe, especially in the south, but also accessing and having to fight the siege warfare with the Muslims, with also these very large fortified cities and so on, brought so much know-how back to Europe. And this is a thing. I personally, this is not a video about it, but I have a bit of a I'm not saying that was not important at all. Actually, it was probably the major factor for the revival of siege engineering into Europe in these centuries. But it wasn't all that. If Europe hadn't had a base on its own at this point of being able to absorb this know-how, having the resources to put this knowledge into practice, they could have contacted the Eastern world as much as they had wanted, but they would have never achieved that. So in here, I like to see actually a very autonomous development also in Europe. If you take the crossbows, for instance, that's something that was entirely. I don't believe it was just a matter of contact with the East. I think that certain developments were pretty much in parallel. And I'm sure, of course, the Eastern world was more advanced than most of Western Europe at this time, but still, that doesn't answer it all. And the same goes for this artillery. And we get tricked according to me, all the time, because since we don't have evidence of that before a certain time, we say it simply did not exist, and they kind of had to have gotten it from somewhere else. I would be more cautious. I don't really buy it fully, and especially the developments of certain tactics, also certain weapons in Europe at this time. It's kind of a, if you think about it, it's kind of a natural consequence of what the warfare was, and in fact politics and societies were developing like at that time. So I don't want to diminish the contacts with the East, but at the same time I like to stress how you don't need someone just to tell you something. You can also figure out by yourself in part. And if you know that something is someone, if you talk with that someone, it's definitely better, because it kind of opens your mind. You're more aware that that there can be more to learn, more to. But at the same time, this is a world where you still have most of the things by yourself. So it's these military engineers represent really the very best of the European science, let's say, and technical skill at the time, and they are kind of one of those symbols, together with in architecture, in juridical, in theological studies, and so on. All the world was speeding up by itself. In so many other things. Just think about the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals that were being built at this time. Those emerged in northern France. Why not somewhere else? But that's obviously northern France and England, by the way, because those were centers that could finally, as given their political unity, cohesion, to afford that for the first time. So it's not about know-how, it's not about the technology in itself, it's about these people first having the conditions to build those things in the first place, that before they didn't have. And naturally, you can see also progress. Obviously, there is an evolution, there is a technical problem solving of many things, so you realize there was an improvement. It's not that those places were able to build Gothic cathedrals also, I don't know, in previous centuries if they had the chance, but surely a lot of that know-how, a lot of that ability came from a pre-gressed notion of many things. After all, Gothic cathedrals were mostly built on ideological basis, like the Musica of St. Augustine, than, let's say, strictly architectural engineering works like Vitruvius, for instance. So this should make us really reflect a bit more on those times and say, wait, but you really need someone who tells you how to build a thing, or can you kind of figure out on your own? Because, by the way, someone who has built that thing before a manual that has always existed, also because that manual could have not been written otherwise. So, yeah, let's look a bit more in detail. And I don't know how much I talked about military engineers today. I actually talked about many other things, but I think it kind of works. And I don't have much to add now. I'm making lots of videos. I started basically doing them every day now for many months. It's not easy, but I kind of like it, so I want to go on, because I believe that also it's the fastest way to get myself known, to make the channel grow. Let's say that I'm not paying for getting promoted at this point, so I don't know why. It sounds kind of stupid, because I could make this channel grow much faster, but maybe I don't need it. First of all, because I'm pretty busy about other things, so even if the channel expanded, I would, especially now, I would freak out, because I feared that I wouldn't have the time to deal with all the for instance, for answering your comments, which is something I still try to do. This is taking me some time indeed, but I also have other things to do, so I don't know. In the future now, also I have to stay out all the day. I don't know how much I can do that. Maybe I will expand into other things, like maybe I can make videos every once in a while if I don't have time to prepare them, but just every once in a while, not on a regular basis. To talking about random topics about history, like method and how about I don't know learning. If you're interested, I don't know about whatever you want, about university, about school, about um, everything that deals actually with what I'm mostly interested in. That is how to learn well. That is something I also trying to figure out myself how to do, and I just want to share my impressions with you. And however, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.